There is a kind of love that does not announce itself. It arrives on a Tuesday, quiet as a man leading a horse down a dirt road, and it does not ask for anything, and it does not make promises out loud, and you might miss it altogether if you are not paying attention to small things. A post set back into dry ground, a rail lifted and nailed without being asked, a pair of boots walking away before the woman inside the house has even had time to come to the door. Willa Marsh was 29 years old when the fence around her farm first fell. She had been a widow for 14 months. She had 2 children who needed feeding, and a piece of land the town of Cedar Creek had quietly decided was more trouble than it was worth. She did not cry about any of this, not where anyone could see. She simply got up each morning and did what the morning required, and at night she sat on the porch and looked at the fence lying in the dust, and she did not know yet that something was already on its way to her. Some things cannot be rushed, not the turning of a season, not the softening of grief, not the kind of trust that grows between 2 people who have both been hurt by the world and learn to move carefully inside it. Some things ask only for time and steadiness and the willingness to show up again and again without making a show of it. The valley knew this. The pines knew this. The dry creek bed that ran along the south edge of her pasture knew this, even when it had nothing left to give. By the time the harvest came in, the fence was standing straight and the corn was tall, and the children were calling his name before his horse had cleared the ridge. And the town, which had watched and waited and whispered, went quiet in the particular way a town goes quiet when it knows it was wrong about something and does not quite have the words to say so. What had grown between Willa Marsh and a man named Cooper Hale was not a dramatic thing. It was a steady thing, and steady things, in the end, are the ones that last. She arrived in Cedar Creek as a bride and left as a widow inside of 3 years, and the town was not sure what to do with that. Her name was Willa Marsh. She was 29 years old, and she had 2 children, a boy of 6 named Thomas and a girl of 4 named Ruth, and she had a farm on the eastern edge of the valley that the land office had registered under her late husband's name and that no one had thought to change. The farm had a small house, a good well, a barn that leaned slightly to the north, and a fence that ran along the road for nearly a quarter mile and had been falling since the summer her husband died. The fence was not a dramatic thing. It was simply old, and it had not been tended, and the posts had worked loose from the ground the way things work loose when no one is watching them, slowly and without ceremony. One post would go, and then the weight would shift to the next, and that one would go too. And by the time Willa noticed, it was 3 posts down and a section of rail lying flat in the dust of the road. She set it back herself the first time, pressing the post into the earth with her hands and tamping the ground around it with her boot heel. It held for a week, and then it fell again. She set it back again. It fell again. Some things are like that. The town of Cedar Creek watched. That was what small towns did. They watched, and they talked, and they formed opinions quietly, and then held those opinions the way people hold things they believe to be true, which is to say firmly and without much examination. The opinion that had formed around Willa Marsh and her farm was not an unkind one exactly, but it was not a hopeful one either. The farm was too much for a woman alone, they said. The land was dry. The east pasture had not produced a decent yield since before the husband took sick. One woman in particular, a Mrs. Martha Cole, who kept a neat house near the Mercantile and attended church with great consistency, had said more than once that the Marsh farm had a way of wearing people down. She did not say it with cruelty. She said it the way people say things they have decided are simply facts. Willa heard some of this and did not hear some of it. She was not the kind of woman who spent much energy on what other people decided about her. She had Thomas to feed and Ruth to feed, and a barn that needed mucking, and a garden that needed water, and a fence that kept falling. and that was enough to fill a day without adding other people's opinions to it. She got up before the children most mornings and started the fire and put the water on and stood at the kitchen window while it heated, looking out at the pasture and the fence line and the road beyond it, which was empty most mornings at that hour. She was not a woman who complained. She was not a woman who asked for things. She had learned, somewhere in the years of her marriage and the months of her widowhood, that asking did not always produce what you needed, and that it was steadier to simply do what could be done and let the rest go. It was a Tuesday in late August when she first saw Cooper Hale. She was in the garden when she heard the sound of a horse on the road, which was not unusual, and she looked up, which was habit, and saw a man she did not recognize leading a roan horse slowly past the front of her property. He was not a young man, and he was not an old one. He was somewhere in the middle of his life, and he moved with the kind of quietness that belongs to people who have made their peace with not being noticed. He had a canvas pack across the horse's back, and a hat pulled low, and he was walking rather than riding, which meant either the horse had a problem with its shoe, or the man preferred to walk. And she could not tell which from where she stood. She thought he would pass. He slowed instead. He looked at the fence the way a man looks at something he is trying to place, not with judgment exactly, but with attention. The way a person looks at a thing that is not the way it ought to be. He stood there for a moment. Then he looped the roan's reins over the standing post at the corner, the one that was still solid, and he walked to where the fallen section lay in the dust, and he picked up the rail and he set it back. He found the loose post and pressed it into the ground, and looked around until he found a good-sized stone and used it to tamp the earth down tight around the base. He did not look toward the garden while he did this. He did not announce himself or ask permission. He simply did the thing that needed doing the way people do things when they are not performing them for an audience. Willa watched him from the garden and did not call out. She was not sure what she would have said. When he was finished, he picked up the stone and set it beside the post in case it was needed again, which was a thoughtful thing to do. And then he untied the roan and continued down the road at the same unhurried pace he had been keeping before. She watched him until he rounded the bend past the cottonwoods and was gone. Thomas came out of the barn a few minutes later and asked her who the man was, and she said she did not know. The fence held through the rest of the week. On Sunday morning, she came out to find one of the other posts had been reset as well, the one she had not gotten to, and a length of new wire had been run along the bottom rail where the old wire had rusted through. She stood looking at it for a long moment. There was no one on the road. There was no note and no explanation, and no indication of who had done it, though she had a reasonable idea. She did not know what to make of it. She went inside and made the children their breakfast, and did not mention it to anyone. The following Tuesday she saw him again, this time coming from the other direction, and this time she was on the porch when he passed. He slowed in front of the fence and looked at it the way a man looks at his own work when he is checking it, which is to say carefully and without vanity. He must have felt her eyes on him because he looked up. He did not wave. He touched the brim of his hat once, the small gesture a man makes when he is acknowledging someone without wanting to make a thing of it. She nodded back. He moved on. She asked at the mercantile the next day if anyone knew a man passing through with a roan horse, not young, not old, quiet about himself. The man behind the counter said that sounded like it could be Cooper Hale, who had taken a room at the boarding house on Elm Street and done some work at the livery, and was not, as far as anyone knew, trouble. She thanked him, and bought her flour and her lamp oil, and went home. That evening she sat on the porch after the children were in bed and looked at the fence, which was standing straight in the late light, and she thought about a man she did not know who had stopped to fix something without being asked and had not waited around to be thanked for it. She did not know what that meant. She was not sure it had to mean anything, but she sat there a good while before she went inside, and the night was warm, and the fence was standing, and that was something. He came back the following Sunday. Willa did not know he would, and she had not planned for it, and when she heard the sound of the roan on the road, she was at the stove with her back to the window, and she did not go to look. She heard the small sounds that followed, the creak of a post being tested, the tap of something against wood, the quiet that comes after work is done. And then she heard the horse move on, and then there was nothing. She went to the window after a moment and looked out, and the fence was standing, and the road was empty, and there was a new rail where the old one had split, cut clean and fitted without a gap. The Sunday after that he came again, and the Sunday after that. By the fourth week she had started putting a plate together before she heard his horse, which was the kind of thing a person does without deciding to do it, the body knowing something the mind has not yet named. She came out onto the porch when he was finishing, and she said she had supper on if he wanted it. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, without fuss or apology. He looked at her for a moment in the way a man looks at an offer he was not expecting and is trying to take the measure of. Then he said, "Thank you," and came inside and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table and ate without making a production of it. They did not talk much during those early suppers. He ate what she put in front of him and said it was good, and she said it was simple, and that was usually the end of it. Thomas watched him from across the table with the open curiosity of a 6-year-old boy who had not had a man at the table in over a year. Ruth sat close to Willa's side and did not say anything, but watched his hands when he reached for the bread. After supper he thanked her and put on his hat and left, and the children went to bed. And Willa washed the plates, and the lamp burned low, and the night was quiet. It was a simple arrangement, and it suited them both, and neither of them said so out loud. The town noticed, because towns notice everything. It started with the mercantile, the way things usually start, a word here and an observation there, nothing definitive but pointed. Someone had seen his horse at her fence line on 3 consecutive Sundays. Someone else had seen him come out of her gate in the early evening. These were facts without context, and facts without context have a way of becoming something other than what they are. By the middle of September, the talk had shape and direction, and Martha Cole had formed a view, which she shared with 2 women after Sunday services, in the manner of someone sharing a concern rather than a judgment, which is a distinction that does not always hold up. Martha's view was that it was not seemly. A widow woman, alone on a farm, with a man coming and going on a regular basis, and no clear arrangement between them, and no chaperone, and no announcement of any kind. She did not say Willa was doing anything wrong. She simply said it did not look right, and that Willa ought to have more care for appearances, particularly with 2 children watching. The women she told agreed in the mild way people agree when they are not sure they agree but do not want to say so to Martha Cole, who had a way of making disagreement feel like a personal failing. Willa heard about it third hand and said nothing. She had known Martha Cole for 4 years and understood that Martha's concern was real in its way, which did not mean it was her business. She did not change anything. Cooper came on Sunday and fixed what needed fixing and ate supper at her table and left before dark. And she saw no reason to alter an arrangement that was causing no harm simply because someone in town had decided it looked a certain way. Some things are too simple to require defending. It was around this same time that a man named Denton came out to the farm on a Wednesday afternoon. He was a landman, or said he was, with an office above the hardware store and a habit of arriving when he thought people were at their lowest. He had spoken to her once before, in the weeks after her husband died, and she had sent him away then and thought that was the end of it. He came to the door with his hat in his hand and a pleasant expression, and told her he had a buyer interested in the east pasture and possibly the whole of it, and that the offer was fair given the state of things. She asked him what state of things he meant. He gestured vaguely at the farm, at the dry pasture, at the fence line, meaning all of it, meaning the difficulty of it, meaning that she was alone and struggling and ought to know it. She told him she was not selling. He said to think about it, She said she had and closed the door. She did not tell Cooper about Denton. It was not the kind of thing she felt she needed to share. But the following Sunday, when Cooper came and she brought out the supper plate, and they sat on the porch after the children were in bed, which had become a habit by then, him with his coffee and her, with her hands quiet in her lap, she found herself looking out at the east pasture in the low evening light and thinking about what it would mean to lose it. The pasture was dry, and it had not been good to her, and it was still hers. And there was a difference between a thing being hard and a thing being hopeless, and she knew which one this was. Cooper looked at the pasture too, sitting beside her on the porch. Not because she had said anything, but because he was the kind of man who noticed what a person was looking at. He said the east field would need the water line cleared before spring if she wanted a decent yield. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble and without opinion attached, as if it were simply a fact about the world he was passing along. She said she knew. He said he could take a look at it next week if she wanted. She said that would be all right. And that was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. And they sat there a while longer in the quiet before he rose and put on his hat, and the roan carried him back down the road in the last of the light. Thomas asked her one evening, while she was braiding Ruth's hair before bed, if Mr. Cooper was going to keep coming. She asked him why he wanted to know. He thought about it with the seriousness of a boy who takes his questions seriously, and said because he liked knowing what was going to happen on Sundays. She tied off the braid and kissed the top of Ruth's head and told Thomas that some things you just had to wait and see about. He accepted this in the way children accept things when the person they trust says it calmly. She put them both to bed and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while looking out at the fence, which was standing straight and solid all the way to the corner post, the whole length of it holding against the dark. The harvest came in better than anyone expected. That was the simplest way to say it, and the truest. The east pasture, which Denton had gestured at with such practiced weariness, produced more than it had in 3 years. The water line Cooper had cleared in late September had done its work quietly and without fanfare, the way good work does. And by the time October arrived, the corn was tall, and the garden had given more than Willa could use before frost, and she had put up enough jars to line the whole of the cellar shelf. She did not make a speech about it. She simply looked at the shelf one afternoon and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. And then she went back upstairs and started supper. Cooper had been coming for 2 months by then, and the Sundays had taken on a shape that felt less like a new thing, and more like a thing that had always been. He would arrive in the mid-morning and move through whatever needed doing. A hinge on the barn door, a section of roof that had lifted in the wind, the fence checked post by post, the way a careful man checks something he has taken responsibility for. Thomas had started following him by the 2nd month, not getting underfoot but staying close, handing things when they were needed, watching how a man's hands moved when they knew what they were doing. Cooper did not make much of this. He simply handed the boy tasks that were within his size and did not praise him extravagantly when he did them right, which was a kind of respect Thomas seemed to understand without being told. Ruth had come around more slowly, the way small children come around to things they are not sure of yet. She had watched him for weeks from a careful distance, from behind Willa's skirt or from the far end of the porch, her eyes following him with the steady attention of someone taking inventory. Then one Sunday, in early October, she brought him a stone she had found in the yard, a smooth, pale one with a dark stripe through the middle, and held it out to him without a word. He took it and turned it over in his hand and looked at it with genuine attention for a long moment. He said it was a good one. She nodded once and went back to the porch, and that was the whole of it, but after that she stopped watching him from a distance. The harvest social was held on the 3rd Saturday of October, as it was every year, in the yard behind the church. Tables were brought out and covered with what people had made, and there was cider and music from a fiddle and 2 guitars, and the children ran between the tables, while the adults stood in the cooling evening and talked about the season and what it had given and what it had taken. Willa brought cornbread and a jar of the preserved peaches she had put up in August, and she arrived without Cooper, because Cooper had not been invited and she had not thought to invite him, and the two of them had not discussed it. She set her things on the table and spoke to the women she knew and kept Thomas and Ruth within arm's reach and did not look for trouble. Martha Cole was there, as she always was, moving through the gathering with the quiet authority of a woman who considers community events part of her particular responsibility. She came to Willa near the cider table, and they spoke for a few minutes about the season and the children, and whether the pass would close early. Martha did not say anything about Cooper. She did not say anything pointed at all, which was unusual for Martha, and which Willa noticed. When they parted, Martha paused and said the cornbread looked well made. It was a small thing, and Willa knew it, but she also knew that for Martha Cole, it was not nothing. And she accepted it as what it was without pressing it further. 2 days after the social, a jar of preserves appeared on Willa's porch. Plum, from the look of the color through the glass, with a cloth top tied in blue string, the way Martha Cole always tied hers. There was no note. Willa brought it inside and set it on the shelf beside her own jars and did not mention it to anyone. Some apologies do not come with words attached, and the wordless ones are sometimes more honest than the kind that explain themselves at length. She thought of Martha and felt something that was not quite warmth but was adjacent to it, and that was enough. Denton did not come back. She heard through the mercantile that he had turned his attention to a property north of town belonging to a family that was actually leaving, which was more straightforward business than the kind he had been pursuing with her. She did not feel triumphant about this. She felt nothing particular about it at all, which was its own kind of answer to the question of how much he had worried her. The evening that changed things did not announce itself. It was a Sunday in late October, the last warm one of the year by the feel of the air, and Cooper had stayed to fix a section of the barn floor that had gone soft near the door. He finished after supper and washed his hands and came out to the porch, and Willa brought coffee, and the children were still up because it was not yet full dark. And they sat together on the porch steps, Thomas and Ruth, while the adults sat in the 2 chairs behind them. It was the first time all 4 of them had sat that way at once, together without arrangement, as if it were simply where everyone belonged at that particular hour. Cooper did not remark on it. Willa did not remark on it. But she felt the shape of it, and she thought he did too. After a while, Thomas leaned back against Cooper's leg, the way a tired child leans against the nearest solid thing, without thinking about it, without asking, the way children do when they have decided somewhere below the level of words that a person is safe. Cooper went still for just a moment, the way a man goes still when something catches him off guard, in a way he was not prepared for. Then he did not move away, and he did not make a sound, and his hand came down very slowly and rested on the boy's shoulder. Not over it. Just beside it. Just present. Willa saw it from the corner of her eye and looked away at the pasture and did not say anything. Ruth had fallen asleep against Willa's side. The fiddle from somewhere down the road had gone quiet. The night was coming in from the east and the stars were beginning, and the fence ran straight and solid along the road, holding everything it was supposed to hold. The town went quiet after that, not all at once, but in the gradual way a sound fades when the source of it has moved on. The Sundays continued, and the work continued, and the suppers continued, and no one had named anything between them, but the naming felt less urgent than it once had, because some things do not need to be named to be real. They only need to continue. And this one was continuing, steadily and without drama, the way the best things do. He came on a Thursday, which was not his day. She heard the roan on the road in the mid-morning and looked up from the garden with her hand still in the dirt and watched him come through the gate with his hat already in his hands, which was not the way he usually came. He usually came with his hat on and his tools ready, and a sense of purpose that was practical and forward-facing. This was different. He walked toward her slowly and stopped a few feet away and held his hat at his side and looked at her with the steady, careful look of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it but understands that decisions of this kind belong to two people and not one. She stood up from the garden and brushed the dirt from her hands against her apron and waited. She did not help him into it or hurry him along. She had learned by then that he said things when he was ready to say them, and that pushing did not produce anything worth having. The morning was cool and clear, and the sky above the valley was the pale blue of late October, and somewhere behind the barn, Thomas was doing something with a stick and a fence post that had been occupying him since breakfast. The world was going about its business, and Cooper Hale was standing in her garden with his hat in his hands. He said he had been thinking. She said she supposed he had. He said he was not a man with much to offer in the way of things that could be counted or put on paper. No land of his own, no house, a horse, and his tools and his ability to work. And that he understood if that was not enough, and he would not press her on it either way. He said this plainly and without apology, the way a man states the truth about himself when he has stopped being ashamed of it and has not yet started being proud of it, just living with it, just saying it the way it was. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said he had already spoken to the man at the timber yard on the North Road about lumber, and that he had an idea for where a house could go on the property without taking from the pasture, up on the slight rise behind the barn where the ground was solid and the drainage was good, and that he could have walls up before the hard freeze if he started within the week. He said all of this still holding his hat, still looking at her, not performing any of it. Then he stopped talking and waited, because that was the kind of man he was. Willa looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the fence, which had been falling when she met him and had not fallen since. She thought about Thomas asleep against his leg in the late October dark, and Ruth and her smooth stone with the stripe through the middle, and the water line cleared, and the harvest that had come in better than anyone expected. She thought about the jar of preserves on the porch with no note, and the supper plates and the coffee on the porch, and the particular quality of the quiet that had grown up between them, which was not an empty quiet but a full one, the kind that only exists between people who have stopped needing to fill it. Some things, she thought, do not need a long consideration. They only need the honesty to be said. She said yes. She said it simply and without tears and without a great deal of ornamentation, the way she said most things. And he nodded once in the way a man nods when he receives something he had hoped for, but had not let himself count on. The corner of his mouth moved. That was the whole of it. She went back inside to put the kettle on, and he went around behind the barn to find Thomas. And she heard the boy's voice rise with some question or other, and heard Cooper's low answer, and then the sound of the two of them walking toward the rise behind the barn, where the ground was solid and the drainage was good. The timber arrived on Saturday. By Sunday, there were 3 men from town who had appeared in the yard without being asked, having heard through the ordinary channels that Cooper Hale was building on the marsh property, and that help would not be refused. One of them was a man named Aldridge, who ran the livery and had not spoken more than a dozen words to Willa in 4 years. He came with his own tools and set to work without preamble and did not explain his presence, and she did not ask him to. By the end of that first Sunday, the foundation posts were in the ground, and the frame of the first wall was laid out in pieces on the flat ground, ready to be raised. Martha Cole came on the Monday with her husband and a pot of bean soup, and set it on the kitchen table and looked around the house the way a woman looks at a house she has been thinking about from a distance and finds less to criticize than she expected. She said the children looked well. Willa said they were. Martha said she thought the rise behind the barn was a sensible place for a house. Good drainage up there. Willa said that was what she had heard. Martha nodded and said she hoped the weather would hold, and Willa said she hoped so too, and they stood in the kitchen together in the particular piece of two women who have moved past something without naming it, which is its own kind of grace. The walls went up over 3 Sundays and part of a Saturday. Cooper worked from first light and Thomas worked beside him, in the way the boy had been working beside him for months now, handing and holding and learning, without being taught in any formal sense, just by proximity, just by watching the way a man's hands move when he knows what he is doing and is not in a hurry about it. Ruth brought them water in a tin cup, back and forth from the well, very serious about the task, making the trip more times than was strictly necessary, because she liked the going and the coming back. By the time the first hard frost came down from the pass, the roof was on, and the door was hung, and the windows were fitted with good glass, and the chimney drew clean on the first fire they lit in it, which Cooper said was luck, and which Willa suspected was something more than that. She stood in the new room with the fire going, and the light moving on the bare walls, and the children sitting on the floor near the hearth. And she thought about the farm the town had called unlucky, and the fence that had kept falling, and the man who had stopped on a Tuesday in August to set it back without being asked. She did not have words for what she felt. She did not look for them. She simply stood in the warm room and let it be what it was. They were married on a Friday in November, before the pass closed, in the small church at the center of Cedar Creek, with Thomas standing very straight beside Cooper, and Ruth holding a bunch of dried yarrow that she had found in the barn and decided was appropriate. The minister kept it short because the cold was coming, and everyone could feel it. When it was done, they walked out into the gray afternoon, and the town was there. Most of it, standing in the road the way people stand when they want to mark something, without knowing quite how. No one said very much. But they were there, and that was its own kind of thing. And Willa looked at them and nodded once, and Cooper put his hat back on, and they went home. And that was the story of Willa Marsh and Cooper Hale, a woman who kept setting the fence back and a man who finally came to stay. And between the two of them they built something the valley would talk about for years, not because it was loud or remarkable, but because it was steady. And steady things have a way of outlasting everything else. The fire burned in the new chimney, and the frost came down from the mountains, and the fence stood straight along the road, and the world continued as it always does, only warmer now, and with one more light in the valley than there had been before. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one.